You're telling me you're leaving 40 acres of good corn standing through the winter because your 13-year-old had a feeling?
Kurt Ainsley stood at the scale house window, clipboard in hand, looking at Tom like he'd just watched him set money on fire. Behind him, two of his elevator workers stopped loading a truck to listen. "Market's good right now, Tom. Won't stay this good. You know that better than anybody, and you're gonna let it sit out there and rot because your little girl read something in a book." Ainsley shook his head, loud enough for the whole scale house to hear. "That's not sentiment, Tom. That's a man who can't say no to his own kid." One of the workers laughed. Josie, standing near her father with her grandmother's old almanac clutched to her chest, felt her face go hot. Tom didn't answer right away. He'd learned in the year since his wife left that giving Kurt Ainsley a reaction was the same as handing him a win. "Tell you what," Ainsley said, tapping his clipboard against the counter, satisfied. "When that corn's still standing in February, buried under snow, worth nothing to nobody, you come back and sell me whatever's left. I'll even still take it. That's how generous I am." He grinned at his workers. Not everybody gets a second chance after a mistake like that. Josie opened her mouth to say something. Tom's hand landed gently on her shoulder before she could. They walked out without another word. Kurt Ainsley had no idea what that standing cornfield was about to do come January. Nobody in that scale house did. They were about to find out. And when they did, it was going to cost Kurt Ainsley the one thing he'd spent his whole career building, the trust of every small farmer in that county. Now, to understand why a 9-year-old girl talked her own father into refusing to harvest a healthy cornfield, and why Kurt Ainsley laughing about it in that scale house was about to become the worst mistake of his career, we have to go back 6 weeks to an almanac her grandmother left behind, and a conversation Josie was never supposed to be listening to in the first place. If you felt your blood boil watching a grown man mock a 9-year-old girl for trying to protect her family, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling me what city, what country you're watching this from. I want to see how far this thing reaches before it's over, because the American farmer exists for exactly this moment. Stay with us, because what that standing cornfield did in January, I promise you, was worth every second of what you just watched. Here's what you need to know. Josie was 9 years old, the only child of Tom Bellwether, who'd been running 200 acres of corn and a small cattle herd alone since Josie's mother left the year before, taking half their savings and leaving Tom to manage the farm, the debt, and a grieving daughter by himself. 6 weeks before that scale house confrontation, Josie had been sitting on the porch with her grandmother's old farmer's almanac, the same worn copy her grandmother left her before she passed, flipping through it the way she did most evenings since her mother left, because it made her feel close to somebody, even if that somebody was already gone. And here's what nobody understood, not even Tom at first. That same week, a county wildlife extension agent had stopped by to talk to Tom about deer damage on the North Fields, and Josie, sitting nearby, overheard him mention something almost in passing. That standing corn left through a hard winter could mean the difference between life and death for livestock and wild game during a severe cold snap, because it provided both shelter from wind and a steady food source buried right there in the field, accessible even under snow. That night Josie went back to her grandmother's almanac and found something that made her sit very still. A section on historical winter patterns and a set of early season signs, a particular kind of heavy fog pattern, an early woolly caterpillar migration, a specific shift in bird behavior, all things her grandmother had circled in pencil decades ago, next to a note. Same as 78, bad one coming. Josie had heard her father mention the winter of 78 before, the one that killed cattle across half the county. That's when everything changed, because Josie spent the next 3 days walking the fields with her father's old binoculars and a notebook, checking every sign her grandmother had circled against what she could actually see happening on their own farm, and every single one matched. She didn't understand meteorology. She was 9. What she understood was simpler. Her grandmother had never been wrong about weather in her whole life, and if this winter matched 78, somebody needed to leave something standing, just in case. So she begged her father not to sell the whole crop, just one field, the one closest to the cattle pens. Leave it standing just this once, just as insurance. Tom, grieving and exhausted, and maybe looking for any reason to trust something his daughter believed in, said yes. Neither of them had any idea that Kurt Ainsley's own operation had just sold off its usual emergency hay reserve fields early that same season, betting everything on a mild winter and a quick profit instead. And here's where it gets worse, because Kurt Ainsley didn't need to guess how thin Tom's finances were running. He had someone telling him directly. Hank Ostrowski, Tom's hired hand for 11 harvest seasons running, a man who knew every field on that farm as well as Tom did himself. For the past 2 months, every time Tom mentioned how tight the fall's cash flow had gotten, every time he mentioned the standing field and how much money it represented sitting unharvested, Hank had been repeating it back to Ainsley's elevator office, in exchange for a standing offer of steady, year-round work once harvest season with Tom inevitably dried up for good. Hank told himself it wasn't betrayal. He told himself Tom's operation was struggling anyway, corn or no corn, and a man had to think about feeding his own family too. He had no idea, mentioning to Ainsley's office, that Tom's little girls got him convinced to leave a whole field standing over some old wives' tale, what he just handed over. Nobody did, not yet. And it didn't stop at the scale house. That's the part that should make your blood boil, because Kurt Ainsley made a show of it for weeks afterward, every chance he got. At the co-op the following Saturday, he told a group of farmers, loud enough for it to carry, that Tom Bellwether's letting a little girl run his whole operation now, and that he'd never seen a grown man throw away good money on a 9-year-old superstition. Laughter followed, easy and familiar. At the county grange meeting the following month, Ainsley stood during announcements and, dripping with mock concern, suggested that some of these smaller operations might want to leave the Almanac reading to their grandmothers and the actual farming to the adults. A comment aimed squarely at Tom, in a room full of people who knew exactly who he meant. Tom stopped attending those meetings after that. He kept the field standing, kept quiet, and let Josie keep checking her almanac notes against the sky every evening, telling himself it was harmless even if it turned out to be nothing. But here's what nobody knew yet, not even Tom. The National Weather Service's long-range outlook, updated that same week, had just shifted quietly, without much fanfare, toward a pattern almost nobody in that county had seen in over 40 years. Tom didn't know about the shifting weather outlook yet. What he knew was simpler. Winter was coming fast, the standing field was still there, and the bank was calling about the operating loan more often than he liked. So he did what any careful farmer would do. He called his loan officer directly and asked for a short extension, explaining honestly that he'd held back one field as insurance against a rough winter, based on his daughter's research and an unusual pattern in the seasonal signs. The loan officer, polite but skeptical, said she'd take it under advisement. Here's what nobody told Tom outright, though it would matter soon enough. That loan officer mentioned the conversation to a colleague at the bank's agricultural lending desk, a colleague who also happened to sit on Kurt Ainsley's grain co-op advisory board. Tom wasn't just managing a tight cash flow anymore. He was being talked about. The first cold snap hit 2 weeks later, hard and early, dropping temperatures 20 degrees below normal for 4 straight days. Ainsley, at the co-op the following week, laughed it off in front of a room full of farmers as just a preview, nothing to worry about. And privately, Tom started to wonder if maybe Ainsley was right. Maybe Josie's Almanac notes were just a grieving kid finding comfort in her grandmother's handwriting. Maybe he'd made a mistake, trusting a 9-year-old's gut over the market. That doubt lasted exactly 9 days. Because that's when the National Weather Service issued its first formal warning. A historic Arctic air mass, the coldest in over 40 years, was set to collide with a major ice storm system in early January. A combination meteorologists were already comparing on air to the deadly winter of 1978. For the first time since the scale house, Tom felt something close to relief. That relief lasted exactly 3 days. Because that's when Kurt Ainsley called Tom directly, not to apologize but with a warning of his own. His own operations hay reserves, sold off early that fall for quick profit, wouldn't be enough to carry his cattle through a storm like the one forecast, and he wanted to know, casually, offhandedly, how much of that standing corn Tom figured he could spare come January at a fair price. Funny how fast a superstition turns into something worth asking about, Tom said, and hung up. But there was something neither Tom nor Ainsley fully understood yet, something about to make this bigger than one field, one farm, or one grain buyer's bad bet. Because that ice storm wasn't going to hit just Tom's farm, or just Ainsley's operation. It was about to knock out power across the entire county for over a week, stranding hay deliveries, freezing water lines, and leaving dozens of small ranches with no way to feed or shelter their herds at all. The storm hit on the second week of January, exactly as forecast, freezing rain first, coating every fence line and power line in inches of ice, then temperatures plunging to 20 below as the Arctic air moved in behind it. Power went out across 3/4 of the county within the first 12 hours. Roads iced over completely. Hay trucks that should have been delivering emergency feed sat stranded on impassable highways for days. Tom's standing field held everything the extension agent had promised it would: shelter from the worst of the wind, food buried right there under the snow, accessible without a single delivery truck. He didn't just feed his own herd. Within 3 days, 2 neighboring ranches, their own hay reserves stranded on the same iced-over roads, brought their cattle to Tom's fence line, desperate, and Tom let them in. Kurt Ainsley's operation wasn't so lucky. Without his early sold reserves, without a standing field of his own, and with the roads too dangerous for emergency hay delivery, his own cattle began dying within the first 4 days of the storm, dozens of head, then more, while the man who'd mocked a 9-year-old's almanac note sat helpless in a farmhouse with no power and no plan. And that same week, the county emergency management office announced it would be running continuous radio broadcasts on generator power, weather updates, road conditions, and a call-in line for farmers to share what resources they had and what they desperately needed. Kurt Ainsley was scheduled to go on air that Thursday, so was Tom. Neither one of them knew, yet, that they'd end up on the same broadcast at the same time. The county emergency broadcast ran on generator power out of a small studio at the courthouse, the only reliable signal left in a county that had been without electricity for 6 days straight. Everybody who still had a working radio and a truck battery to run it was listening. Kurt Ainsley had requested airtime that Thursday to talk about resource sharing between local grain operations. A careful phrase, Tom suspected, for getting ahead of the story before anyone asked why his own cattle were dying while his elevator sat full of corn he'd bought cheap from other farmers that fall. Ainsley didn't know the county extension agent, the same one who'd mentioned standing corn's winter value to Tom back in the fall, had also been asked onto the broadcast that same hour to give official guidance on emergency livestock care. And he didn't know that Tom and Josie, huddled in their truck cab with a hand-crank radio for reception, had just heard the announcement that the call-in line was open. Ainsley opened his segment exactly the way Tom expected. Confident, smooth. Rough winter for everybody, he said, But I think what we're seeing is a lesson in the importance of getting good prices at harvest instead of gambling on a crop sitting in the field losing value. Sound market decisions matter more than luck, especially in a storm like this one. The host, reading from a list of call-in requests, said, "We've actually got a caller on the line who'd like to respond to that. Tom Bellwether, you're on the air." Tom didn't hesitate. "Kurt, we're not talking about luck. My daughter read a pattern in her grandmother's almanac back in November and asked me to leave one field standing, just in case. That field's fed my herd for 6 days straight with no power and no road access. It's also feeding the Hendersons' herd and the Millers' herd since Wednesday, because their reserves are stranded same as everybody else's." The host asked the extension agent to weigh in. "For what it's worth," she said, "the specific pattern Josie identified, the early caterpillar migration, the fog cycles, the bird behavior shift, those are legitimate folk indicators with a documented correlation to severe winter patterns going back generations. What she noticed wasn't superstition. It was observation. Good observation." Then the calls started coming in, one after another, faster than the host could keep up with. "A rancher from 2 farms over. We brought our herd to Tom's fence line Tuesday night. Wouldn't have made it through Wednesday without that field." "A woman from the Henderson place. Same here. 6 days without power, and that standing corn's the only reason we've still got a herd left to worry about." A third caller, a man Tom didn't even recognize, from Clear on the other side of the county. "I heard about that little girl's almanac last month at the co-op, and folks were laughing about it. I want it on record, I'm not laughing now." The calls kept coming, 4, then 6, then more than the show had time left to take, and every single one of them was a family whose herd had survived because of a field a 9-year-old girl insisted on saving. Kurt Ainsley's confidence didn't leave his voice right away. That was the worst part for him. You could hear it live on a countywide broadcast, staying steady for a beat too long while the calls kept stacking up behind him, before it finally, audibly, cracked. "I think," he said, quieter now, "we should probably move on to road conditions." The host didn't let him. "Actually, Kurt, since you're on, how are your own herds doing this week?" Silence, long enough that the host had to ask again. "We've lost some head," Ainsley finally said, "more than I'd like." He didn't get to hang up on his own terms. He sat there in that studio, mic still live, while caller after caller kept crediting a 9-year-old girl's almanac notes for saving herds his own early-sold hay reserves couldn't protect. The broadcast running long past its scheduled slot, because nobody at the station wanted to be the one to cut it off. The ice storm broke 9 days after it started. Power came back gradually, county by county, road by road. Tom's field, picked clean by his own herd and 2 borrowed ones, had done exactly what Josie's almanac notes said it might. Hank came around a few weeks later, quieter than usual, and told Tom the truth about the calls he'd made to Ainsley's office all fall. Tom didn't say much back. He just nodded and let Hank keep working, the way he always had. Josie's grandmother's almanac sat on the kitchen table that spring, dog-eared and worn, next to a new notebook Josie had started keeping herself. Her own observations now, alongside her grandmother's. When a local reporter called for a follow-up story, Tom kept it simple. She wasn't guessing, she was paying attention. Everybody laughed at that right up until they needed it. That right there is why we tell these stories. If this one hit you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to The American Farmer. Drop a comment below and tell me, did you see it coming? Because I want to know. We'll see you in the next one.